It looks like we are alive.
Welcome back, everyone, to another special episode of Artie and Fist. We're doing an interview tonight with Eric Aarvoll from Return to the Land, one of the few intentional white-only communities. I believe it's in Arkansas. Is that right,
That's
Eric?
right. Yeah, Northeast Arkansas.
Now, Eric has gotten a lot of flack. You made the decision to sort of publicize the fact that you're building this community rather than sort of doing it on the down low, and you got a lot of backlash for the horrible crime, it seems, of wanting to make a community where white people hang out together. I know, it's the worst possible thing ever. But it seems to be going like really well, actually. Like you said that you were getting like a lot of applications and stuff. How did you come to this point where you decided to set up like a intentional white community?
Sure. Yeah. So people have criticized the decision to speak with the media. That's just always been my policy personally. If someone wants to talk, I feel like we'll all be better off if we hear each other's perspectives. I'm very pro dialogue and discourse. But also, I don't think we have forever to really normalize this sort of thing and set some kind of cultural or even legal precedent. I do think that while Trump is in office, we have a far better chance if anything does go to, say, the Supreme Court of a favorable decision coming down. And that could be hugely consequential because if the right court makes the right decision in a case related to all this, that might provide some kind of a pathway, an avenue where identitarians, people who care about their European heritage in the US, have an option. Right now, there's no clear way forward. A lot of people want to see top down political change or mass remigration. And in some countries, maybe that is possible, right? A place like Norway was 99% white until like 3 weeks ago. So you could probably just send all those people back. The US, though, there are more than 100 million non white people. We're not going to have the kind of America that we had prior to the 1980s. It's been too long established. There are multiple generations of these people. And also, we invited them here. I know that people who see things my way or who are aligned with our way of thinking wouldn't have set that policy, but that was the explicit policy. So if as a nation you invite all of these people around the world to come join your society as equal citizens, then it would be kind of morally wrong to turn around and say, never mind, even though you've been here for 3 generations, now your great grandkids are going to go back home to Vietnam or whatever, where they've never seen the place. So it doesn't pass a smell test for me. The idea of mass remigration in the US, it doesn't fit our context. And also, most white Americans don't support it. It is this very small but vocal minority on platforms like X that talk about it, and they'll get standing ovations in that crowd, right? And it's easy to rile people up on the internet where everyone's anonymous. There are no real world consequences. It's basically just projecting power fantasies and venting frustrations about the actual world. So I've seen this behavior for a long time, and I saw that this isn't realistic. We're not going to have a white nationalist state in America. So what can we do? Well, we have this kind of liberal enlightenment philosophy, and we have principles of self-government and local government. And so just taking those aspects of the American system, it fits with a broadly, vaguely libertarian, conservative platform that we should encourage different groups of people to go their own way. And that doesn't mean that that's the extent of it or that's where all of this ends up after, decades or centuries. But right now, there is a very tangible path forward to create kind of a state within a state, our own parallel society, where we get to actually implement all of those policies that we believe in. So I might believe in a lot more top down central planning. I might believe in more like socialistic policies in education, et cetera. I don't want that done at the federal level, right? Because it wouldn't be done in my interest. A lot of tax money would be wasted. They'd be taking my money and redistributing it to brown kids or whatever. And yet in our own parallel networks, we have a huge degree of latitude to experiment with what is actually good for our people. Now, it means that we have to figure out how to do that for ourselves, but I don't see why we shouldn't be able to do that. So it's not an easy sell. It's a lot easier to say, we're going to get the government to violently turn the country back into what it was 50 or 60 years ago. And that's not realistic, but it is saleable. It's emotionally satisfying to people. Whereas what I've been pushing for a long time, like when I first heard about the demographic trajectory in detail and really understood racial differences and kind of grasped the full implication of things, 2011, 2012, pretty much right away, I saw that there is no path forward other than building our own thing, building it up. And then once we actually establish ourselves and have prosperity and social cohesion and get back to the place we should have been, well, then what does the rest of the country look like then? And what are the scales like in 50 years, 60 years, when the rest of the country is declining because of these predictable factors like multiculturalism, differential birth rates, lowering IQ? And meanwhile, we've been practicing eugenics and doing all this good stuff. There are no explicit like interventionist eugenic policies in Return to the Land, but we are very pronatal. And, you know, some communities might be more explicit about stuff like that going forward. The point is, with the network of communities, we can actually put all of our theories and ideas into practice and see how that positively impacts our people, or does it? And so if we have a bunch of different communities trying a bunch of different policies and programs, then within a half century, within a century, maybe we develop the kind of peak strategy as a group and we're in a really good position. And that's something from now until then, I can do that and take care of my kids, provide communities for my extended family, and also reap the benefits of that immediately. Instead of, you know, some people would advocate, go into the system, you know, go become a lawyer, go join the CIA. Well, that means that the next X number of years of my life will be spent in that multicultural system, as opposed to, you know, daily actually lifting up my own people. I would much rather do that. So it seems like a clear, this is the obvious path forward. It always has since I first heard this stuff, you know, more than a decade ago. But now I think people are kind of coming around and seeing that this is something not just ideologically desirable, but pragmatically desirable. We're reaching that tipping point where conditions in the rest of the society are going down. It's becoming economically tougher with AI replacing jobs and so forth. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And here we have an alternative to say, you can start going in the other direction by linking up with our people and helping each other.
I mean, that's also sort of fundamental to the original vision of America as well. That you know, people, they go places and they try new social systems and build like strange communities. A history of all kinds of weird communities that have, you know, like been spun up all over America. You know, when they were fleeing the English and various kinds of stuff. Do you think that the sort of the general milieu and the sort of breakdown that we're seeing, the competency crisis, is going to lead to a sort of general destabilization that will allow for more room for the startup of different kinds of systems and more experimentation than would have been allowed, say, you know, in the post-war period?
Yeah, I do tend to think that the direction of technology has been decentralizing rather than centralizing, with a few exceptions. So you have a push-pull where, on the one hand, AI is something where massive data centers, a larger library to train these models on, is kind of a necessary component. And so only, you know, companies run by Elon Musk and, you know, ChatGPT and Google and all that, they can compete in that space where we can't. However, most of the other technologies, including social networking technologies, ironically, like the presence of these really powerful LLMs is allowing smaller firms with fewer employees to do more. So even the kind of centralizing tendencies are creating opportunities for the periphery to strengthen itself. And it's really going to be survival of the most adaptive and clever, and the people who are least bogged down in established, we have to run things this way. I think the experimental, smaller, agile firms will be the ones that succeed outside of a few particular domains, like owning these massive server farms and even in military terms, because ultimately, the way that political power balances out is sort of just a reflection of the distribution of real world force potential. I'm like a realpolitik or a political realist. And in military terms, with drones, with the capacity for, and I don't endorse, pursuing this route as individuals or groups, but a lone cell actor can engineer bioweapons nowadays with what's available. And that means there's going to be this tendency for the periphery to grow stronger and stronger, and the center, which is bureaucratically bogged down, is not going to be able to compete. So, yeah, I mean, also internationally, smaller actors like right now, El Salvador, with Bukele, like they're able to institute all of these social policies because it's one guy making top-down decisions. I think he's a millennial, and so he's kind of, forward thinking, you might say, not so conservative in that sense. They're handing out like AI training models for their kids to incorporate into public education. I have mixed feelings about AI to some extent, but I do think it is very well suited to teaching. And I've noticed that when I want to learn subjects, having the back and forth question answer with AI is immensely helpful. If I had that when I was a kid, I would be much further down my course of study than I am now, right? So
do you think that the distribution of these incredibly powerful technologies to the periphery, to small groups and individuals, is going to make sort of the cultivation of virtue a much more salient issue for countries now that top-down sort of enforcement of virtue, sort of the model that most people think of now, whereas rather than cultivating virtue in the person or in the community, it's sort of imposed from above. Do you think there'll be a sort of a resurgence of this idea, like potentially as a sort of great filter mechanism, that those groups that do not cultivate virtue may in fact like grasp these technologies and extinguish themselves long term?
yeah, more powerful technologies or instruments aren't necessarily good or bad in themselves. They're simply more powerful. And so if you use them wisely, that can give you a huge outsized advantage. If you use them poorly, then you can just self-destruct. So yeah, it is introducing an interesting kind of selection mechanism for prudence in some sense. And I think ultimately that will cash out, and we're seeing it at the genetic level in parallel, that will cash out in more traditional societies that aren't hopelessly conservative winning out, where we rely on, well, this is what's worked for generations, but also in like limited controlled contexts, we heavily invest in emerging technologies and are willing to experiment with how we structure our firms and do business. So I think it is sort of cutting out a straight and narrow path for success that the smaller actors will find before the larger actors. We're also entering a world where like international finance itself is more decentralized than ever before. right? Like in the past, it was more or less an ethnic monopoly. And now, actually, especially with crypto markets and the whole finance space exploding in a million different instruments that you can hold and invest and speculate on. Now we have this international financial elite that's partly thinking our way, or at least adjacent to it. And some of these people are investing in smart cities. Like there's one, I think it's in Honduras, actually. There's one that they're building somewhere in the Mediterranean. So what I'm doing from a white identitarian perspective in the US, thinking about, just preserving my heritage as a white American, because where exactly is our place going to be if America is this multiracial melting pot? Well, other people who are much more aggressive on the technological front are also thinking of this parallel society solution. The network state is widely read, Balaji's book. And we read it in our reading group leading up to establishing Return to the Land. So these ideas are out there. People are experimenting with them. And yeah, it will really select for the people who are high information, but also adequately traditional. Because,
I mean, I was looking at, I know you're really into Neoplatonism. I'm not a PhD in philosophy by any means. My background is IR and politics, but I was curious what you said before about sort of moribund conservatism. Like, I mean, if you think about sort of the principles of like people like Plotinus, I think like these ideas that have lasted thousands of years, and yet things have changed so much. It's a weird balance that you need traditions, and yet the world is always changing. So you have to sort of find a balance between ossifying yourself into a path that breaks under the forces of change, but still finding I guess the parts of like human wisdom that endure. Like so I'm like a Orthodox Christian, and it's one of the things I really like about the Orthodox Church is that sort of general sense that there are sort of actual fundamental timeless lessons that can be carried forward even through changing times, if that makes sense.
Well, sure. Yeah. The Orthodox Church is a good example of that. Axial age philosophy in general has held up remarkably well. And I think that's because there are constants in human nature, and those who pursue virtue in earnest will basically coincide on a limited number of paths and insights and even metaphysical models, right? There's a lot of similarity between Orthodox Christianity in its theology and pagan Neoplatonism in its. Arguably, a lot of that is cross-pollination and direct influence, but there's also these similarities with Eastern philosophy. Anywhere you have intelligent people who are conscientious, who are civilized, who want to pursue self cultivation, they reach similar concepts. And what that really boils down to is keeping that essence and not holding on to too much all of the concomitants to that essence. So this is sort of the idea between anti-fragility versus like a really robust system. So you can have more like a bigger structure, a more complicated with more joints and more things holding it together, and have a larger kind of tradition that you're trying to maintain. And that might be like a hyper orthodox mentality where every detail, like I guess Orthodox Jews in some contexts kind of devolve into this. And that's the legalism that is warned against in the New Testament, right? This ossification. And yet, if you go in an entirely libertine direction, you lose that essence and you're going to alienate yourself from what was true. Like the idea that ancient people got nothing right is crazy. Of course, they tapped into the same essential truth that we have access to now. And so a combination of just using right reason and also making sense of your tradition and taking what you can from it, I guess helps to avoid those two extremes.
Yeah, Islam suffers from the same kind of legalism. It's interesting to consider that legalism seems to result from when the principles need to be elucidated too much. It becomes like too top down. You don't trust the people to understand those principles themselves, and so every eventuality must be planned for. If I could ask, after you did that interview on TMZ, I think that was the first big one. I started seeing a bunch of stories coming around that the state government in Arkansas was like looking for ways to shut you down. My understanding is that you're a private members association, and unlike in the UK, unfortunately, in the US, you are still allowed to use a private members association for various things. It doesn't seem like it has come to anything. Has it come to anything, or are the state government in Arkansas just sort of like seething at you without any like sort of actual recourse?
I don't think they have any incentive to actually shut us down. They have the incentive to look into our case, and that's what the attorney general in Arkansas said, that they were investigating it. And then when another reporter later on inquired at their office, they said that according to their preliminary investigation, nothing we're doing is unlawful. Now, if they really tried, I'm sure they could find some way to try to attack us. But why would they, when the Republican base that they depend on politically is going to tend to be at least lukewarm towards us? You know, many of them, like ordinary Republicans, are now at a point where they think what we're doing is a good thing and they explicitly support it, would consider joining. And I think the majority think that we should be allowed to do, even if they don't personally agree and they wouldn't live this way, they believe in live and let live, and they have the right to do it. So it would really make the Republican base angry if a Republican leaning state, AG, and like the state administration more broadly attacked us. It's just like not politically wise. The same goes for the federal attorney general and Pam Bondi and Trump's Justice Department and all of that. Like, why would they attack us? They're going to piss off their base and split their vote. And the Republican Party is already in a civil war with itself. So it just doesn't serve their interests. Now, if this was Biden's America, well, then very likely they would have done something at the federal level, if not at a state level. Arkansas will probably continue to be a red state for a very long time. And there are a lot of people in Arkansas who are very explicitly on our side. Why would they create that opposition for themselves internally? But the state, the feds might have done something. And in the future, under a Democratic administration, we might actually have charges filed against us. Or now there's an ongoing investigation, and we've had requests for documents. So it's not like it's over, but I think the real attacks won't begin until another Democrat gets in, which unfortunately might be pretty soon.
So for the crime of gathering while white, essentially, like it's I mean it's so weird, right? Like, to see how far freedom of association has been undermined in the US. It is supposed to be a fundamental principle, and yet it just seems to have decayed and decayed and decayed to the point where you now see people making the argument that you just like freedom of association, but not that kind of freedom of association. You would need to have a black commissar, for example, right? Like, just a racial equity officer, just to hang out at your private community and just, make sure that there's no one saying any naughty words. It's a very, very weird dystopian kind of perversion of what seemed to be the original American values.
Right. And going back to the Civil Rights Act and when the Fair Housing Act was passed and all of that, the justification for restricting our freedom of association in the public domain kind of makes sense, in that it's historically been considered a core function of government to secure access to markets. there are many states that exist today because at some point in the past, they were a band of mercenaries that protected access to a public market, like the Kievan Rus. Russia today comes from that's the origin of that state. They secured access to markets. So if you have citizens, and after slavery ended and Black people gained the vote and everything else, what are you going to do except as a state secure access to public markets to all your citizens? Equality under the law is a core principle. Of course, our founders imagined that the citizenry would be people of European descent. That was explicit from the beginning. But because of the legacy of slavery, because of how everything shook out, we were a multiracial society. And what are you going to do consistently with our liberal principles other than something like what the Civil Rights Act and Fair Housing Act did? Now, that kind of pushes us in a corner where now, if in the public domain, we can't just go create our own towns, our own neighborhoods, selling real estate to the public, our own public-facing restaurants and motels, because again, public commerce. Right. The government has an obligation to secure access. So we can't engage in the domain of public commerce, but we can engage the domain of private associations. And the authors of the Civil Rights Act actually did have a bit of foresight there, where they made exceptions for private associations. And this is the conflation that people have made in the ensuing decades, where legislation that was directed at public commerce, and those were the legal arguments. It was like, well, what if a Black guy traveling interstate isn't able to be accommodated in a motel because of racism? Therefore, we have to pass these laws to secure access. But then we've extended that because people think in fuzzy terms. We've extended that to the private domain and thought policing and what we're allowed to say in private conversations. And that's been enforced through this much broader extended bureaucracy, including, the fourth estate, including the media, including finance. And it's only recently that their monopoly on power has been broken because of the internet and alternative financial technologies. And so now I don't think there's any way back. Essentially, they made a valid legal argument, did what they could with it, and then it was scope creep over the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And now we're not going to let them get away with it, and we're going to have to rein it back into that one legitimate legal argument, which does have to do with public commerce. And we're going to have to clarify for people the difference between the public domain and the private domain. And we should also reinforce that America was a collection of private towns. It wasn't about one big open public market. And as other factors kind of drive more towards local community and novel social networks, having IRL manifestations, then I think that there will be some kind of awakening to this and a change. Like wealthy people move to gated neighborhoods. And now more and more alternative thinking groups, I think, will move towards intentional community. And part of what we're doing is setting that precedent and setting that roadmap for here's how you can actually go your own way and not fall into this one monoculture, which people rightly now criticize, like the American culture that's disseminated worldwide, McDonald's and hip hop and whatever. So.
Yeah.
So
go on.
Yeah,
I'm still here.
Yeah. So I like that you say roadmap, because I've noticed, and I've commented on this on my channel, where not just people on the right, but other white nationalists, let's say, have not necessarily supported what you're doing, right? And I've had kind of difficulty finding like a good faith criticism of what you're doing from other white nationalists. I would assume that since they're white nationalists, they would be on board with what you're doing, especially like Nick Fuentes, who decides to stay in Chicago, and actually said to Richard Spencer recently that he prefers that than going to like return to the land or having something like that. So I'm having trouble finding like a good faith criticism of Return to the Land from white nationalists. What do you suppose is like the beef that some of them have?
Well, part of it is personal. So
Okay.
Fuentes and I got in a dispute recently because there was a clip going around where he talked about it's your birthright,
Hmm.
America, etc. And people interpreted that as a statement about birthright citizenship. I didn't exactly think that's what he meant because I had watched his show before and I knew he didn't stand for that policy. But on the other hand, keeping those people here, I think, is basically entailed by Catholic social teaching, which presumably he abides by. Like the Catholic Church would never endorse breaking up a family, they wouldn't endorse mass remigration for that reason unless it kept families together and there was all these protections to
Hmm.
not hurt the poor and stuff. So anyway, I asked a clarifying question in DMs about that before I went publicly trying to defend him because he was being, I think, partly unduly attacked. And he threw me under the bus and denounced me. And, because I've been vocally critical, not in a mean spirited
More so
way, just,
inquisitive for clarification to make sure that you're both on the same page and
yeah,
in terms of
with
advocacy
that
moving
DM.
forward.
But prior to that, I mean, I had been relatively critical of some aspects of his platform, so to speak, where he thinks we should infiltrate the institutions and go for top down change. And like my criticism wasn't even that that's necessarily impossible.
It
Someone
has to be
like
done correctly.
Devin Stack thinks it's impossible. I don't go that far. I would say it's impossible without organizing in advance. It's
To
like,
yeah, to make sure that your guys don't get subverted when they go in. So I believe
yeah,
you had said
of
something like,
course.
a year of schooling, so to speak, concurrently taught with sectors that they want to go into, right? So it's like a very
Right.
focused type. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so a year prior to all of this, I had gone up to visit Nick in person to pitch this concept that, like, essentially, I actually like what you're doing because I do want our guys in positions of influence, but I don't think it works unless you have some kind of formal training process where
Yes.
people go through, get inculcated in our worldview, fortified, actual real world vetting occurs. So you don't just have an anon account with an avatar of a frog and assume that, oh, well, this frog avatar says they work now in the State Department, therefore our guys are in there. It's almost like QAnon tier, like,
Yeah,
patriots
but
are in control kind of thing. You don't know that unless you've met all these people and unless they have been properly vetted. And that's kind of the point of colleges also for the elites. It's to vet potential recruits for elite networks. Okay, so we should do the same thing. Jews are able to have influence in our society because they have their own nation state, they have their own organizations, they have their own religious groups and synagogues, etc., where they network, they vet each other, they get to know each other, they inculcate each other in their relatively coherent ideology. And then that thing entering our institutions, which are by comparison a lot more diffuse,
mhm.
it can maintain its coherence and exert some kind of coherent influence. Russia, there are Russian operatives in the US. Well, they have their own state where they stage that infiltration. Staging an infiltration by announcing on a live stream, hey, go join the CIA, just strikes me as insane.
Yeah, and it's the powers that be are not very keen on this. So you sort of you decided to try and take it like a step down, recognizing that it was the destruction and infiltration of the universities that fundamentally led to the institutions that we have now, and that you need to have these essentially universities. I think you were saying you wanted to do like a year course on like basic philosophy and political realism and stuff to prepare these kind of people for like government and stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Insofar as my skills or orientation could aid any kind of top-down political influence, it would be in forming that kind of preparatory institution. So post-high school, pre-college, because college is where the indoctrination happens. And a lot of people, when they get in there, I mean, you can like self-delude for a long time working for the enemy. Like day to day, you're spending your time working for people who are totally antithetical to our interests. And yet, because, well, I'm going to put myself in the right position one day, it's like a promissory identitarian thing where one day it's all going to pan out and I'll be working for us. But in actual fact, like day to day, you're just working for them because that's just how it is. You get sucked into these systems and you're not putting your efforts in a coordinated way towards realizable goals or achievable goals. You're just sort of scattering our best and brightest into the system. It's going to eat them up unless we have our own training institutions and also some kind of, I don't know, center where people can come back to, or multiple centers, physical centers they come back to on an ongoing basis where those relationships are maintained. Because I don't think we all watch the same live streamer is sufficient to maintain the kind of rapport and trust and like-mindedness that you would need to be an organized block capable of exerting change. So that is what I was pitching. And in a broader sense, the whole parallel society thing, it's just that writ large, where because the existing institutions are corrupt, we should build our own institutions and just compete holistically. We have enough people and resources now. Like the mass red pilling already occurred. Millions of Americans feel this way. It's never going to be hundreds of millions of Americans. You know, it's probably not going to be an outright majority because a lot of the white people out there, they're left-wing and they're not going to be persuaded. They're in mixed race relationships. They have close relatives that are in mixed race relationships. You're not going to convert some old white boomer who has grandchildren that are non-white to become a white nationalist. There's no way. And there are too many of those people. So it's just, you know, we need our own institutions where we grow our own power. And at some point, if that allows us to use existing power structures for our advantage, then we should do that. But just jumping straight for that, like that's step one, I don't think that's wise.
And well, Nick Fuentes doesn't really like coalition build. Who does he necessarily work with? He has a collectivist identity, but he's very isolated. It's almost like he's like a version of like a right-wing Hassan Piker in a sense, where he's like putting forth this like collectivist identity, but it just so happens that kind of it all goes to him, and he's not necessarily coalition building. Like I would expect a white nationalist to be someone that has people on the ground actually putting in the work to do a intentional white society would be platforming that. And then it was really strange for me to see that, and it made me start to realize that like he's really good at criticizing Israel. He's good at criticizing, but in terms of like actually building something, and then for his followers to like start shitting on return to the land, I was completely put off by that. And I've tried to make this distinction to my audience like a lot of times, where like politically he functions as someone that criticizes Israel very well. He does that very well. But in terms of like coalition building, community building, and how he doesn't seem to want to, I think, how did you phrase it? Like the sacrifice. He would say that he has gone through sacrifice, but when you say sacrifice, it's not that you reap all of the rewards. It's that you would reinvest, sacrificing what you're taking. I watched your video on money, and it really resonated with me about not just thinking in terms of that material currency, but kind of like it's what does that get you, and it's resources, and it's working with people, and it's how you can operate outside of the current system, but still in the system. And I feel like his community will give you this like false dichotomy of, oh, so you just want to like run off to the woods or whatever. And it's like, no, I'm pretty sure Eric Aarvoll wants to do it all. And he was doing what can be done. And if there's another opportunity that comes up, to be prepared to be able to execute on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I try to think in Bayesian terms in general. Like, I don't know what's going to happen.
Mhm.
I don't even know for sure theoretically what's more sound, like an infiltrationist strategy or a parallel society strategy. I I really don't, but I can assign probabilities based on what I do know currently, and I can invest resources proportionally to my expectations. And so, like me wanting to go up and visit with Nick to pitch him a real world institution we could build together,
Mhm.
that was trying to invest proportionally in what seemed like a possibly good outcome. Not the only thing that I would want to do. Um, yeah, and it is this sort of black and white thinking
Yeah.
that it's kind of pervasive in general. People have a really hard time thinking about multiple options in Bayesian terms. People typically they think this is going to be the winner. Like successful bettors or gamblers in horse races, they don't throw everything in on one horse. But
Right.
that is the natural instinct. Like the amateur who goes in there trying to win, they think this is the horse with the best odds. But what you should do is a Bayesian model where based on your best evidence, you assign a bunch of different probabilities to the different contestants. And then you proportionally invest that much. And if you're right in your Bayesian analysis, your probability assignation, then you should hypothetically do better than the other gamblers. So I think politics is sort of the same way. We have, and also like people are not thinking about those kind of edge cases because in the news cycle, we're thinking about what is kind of politically salient on a 2 to 4 year
Right.
cycle, which only looks at certain occurrences. Like he covers on his show that domain. It has to do with geopolitics in the background, and there are long run things that are happening, but it's all in kind of ordinary political terms. He's not thinking about, um, well, what if any of these systems do collapse? And they would just kind of write that off as totally impossible. But in the long run, every advanced society in history has run up to that kind of condition. You know, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome. Things happen, like a real pandemic may happen that results in mass deaths, or a engineered bioweapon, like some unprecedented novel technology disrupts things. Um, there are just many things that could happen where they're not thinking about that tail of the bell curve and what to do. And here's another Talebian principle where when you're investing, it's you actually shouldn't invest in absolutely all outcomes because we're not looking to just maximize gain in a horse race. We're also wanting to survive. First of all, oh man, I hate this.
That's
Uh,
fine.
yeah, I forget every time what the hand command is. It's one of those AI enhanced,
Ah,
supposedly,
see, AI makes
cameras.
everything better, man.
Right.
Right?
One of
Well,
the shittier aspects of
let me
AI.
see if I can broaden this.
I thought you were using
Dang.
like telepathy for a
Oh,
moment there. I'm like, Jesus, this guy is tapping into some fucking ancient knowledge right now. This thing's fucking working on its own right now.
There's now it's all zoomed in on my face. Very distracting. Okay, what was I even just saying? I'm gonna keep on experimenting.
You were talking
Yeah,
about
this is going to be very distracting for you. So if you want,
you were talking
go ahead.
about thinking in Bayesian probability terms and how
Oh yeah.
you
So
don't
the
want to add like aim for the edge of the distribution curve, the black swan event, because they're statistically like highly unlikely. I presume you were about to say that you want to aim for the cluster of probabilities in the center of the curve instead of like
Should I quickly
That's like
try
the
to
middling. I'm looking to, at the margin in the short term, win in betting. What actually matters is avoiding the black swan that kills you and investing in the black swan that no one else invests in. So
okay.
it's a barbelling strategy. So the very high upside potential opportunities, you want to be one of the few people considering them. In my opinion, parallel communities, intentional communities structured in this novel way, that's like this untapped space that has huge potential upside. Many people are not investing in it at all. And then on the other hand, like the possibility of catastrophic collapse, this same strategy is insulating us from that, and we're living in a more sustainable, secure way from that perspective. The intermediate stuff is more what you see and think about on a day-to-day basis, but that's not where like tech innovators or new startup corporations that dominate everything, that's not really where they come from. The actors that end up dominating everything else, they are marginal at first. So again, it is Bayesian analysis, but with this addendum that you need to barbell your investment strategy, avoid getting knocked out of the game, and put yourself in a position where that outlier opportunity, you're one of the early investors.
So so how is Return to the Land going? How's your year been? You look like you're
Hold on. Should I try to like remove you and add you again? Do you think that would
Well,
help?
I think my camera is just locked in. I can turn my camera off and on. Maybe that'll work.
yeah, maybe
Whatever
that
doesn't distract you, okay?
Oh boy.
I actually, I'm really curious about this. Like, sometimes in the morning, do you look in the mirror and you're like, you know what? I don't know if I can keep going. This is so much. I've stacked so much on my shoulders. And then you look in the mirror and see your own physiognomy, and you're like, I have to do it. Blonde hair, blue eyes, this ancient jawline. Do you ever just look in the mirror?
No,
You
I
also
don't
gonna
tend
do
to
it.
think in those terms.
Okay.
I do feel a strong sense of obligation because
Yeah.
very few people are doing what's necessary. And it's like in my own, like if I had all of my preferences realized, I would be conducting an orchestra. You know, I'd be teaching philosophy. I would
Right.
not. Homesteading in Arkansas is cool too. Like I do like that, but it's not principally my passion. And even like organizing communities like this, like I wanted to organize an educational community that I was, you know, intrinsically drawn to, but it's more like a lot of people wanted to see communities like this realized, and no one was making it happen. And I wouldn't have done it unless Peter Siri also showed up, where he
Yep.
ran communities in South America. He came with the necessary skills, and he's just very intelligent. So it was, yeah. Go ahead.
How did your trip to Arania help evolve what you're doing as well?
Well, I mean, we definitely did take to heart a lot of what we learned there. But a lot of it, like we were kind of on that trajectory already. It made me think more about like the financial institution. Yeah, like so for example, they structure as a share block company. They don't own deeds to land. They own shares in the Arania company. We did that same model without even understanding that that's how they organize things. Actually visiting with them, I mean, it did make me think more about the importance of how do you build a culture that supports government at the same time. And we have to think in terms of establishing our own government effectively. We have our own meetings, our own elections, our own representatives. And in Arania, like they're very civically engaged to kind of an extreme degree. And so I started thinking about how do you build the culture that builds the right kind of civic space, and also on a financial level, like they have their own bank, and like how they finance their lots, how they develop their lots. It's all very intelligent. And some of the people we've been working with who are building another community elsewhere in our broader network, they're kind of emulating the way that Arania does its development. And I think it's a really good idea. So there are, you know, specific points like that. The biggest thing was that culture of civic engagement and how to actually capture that.
I imagine it must be a lot easier to be civically engaged if you're surrounded by people who are like you, and there's, you know, your input is actually going to have an effect. I mean, you know, arguably this is one of the big problems with like large cities. You just your civic engagement just gets lost. It's very, very hard to have any sort of like actual real effect, which goes back to what I think you were saying earlier about smaller communities.
Yeah.
How has it been going this year?
Yeah, like in 2025.
Yeah. How's your year been, mate?
From what I hear, from what you've said, is that like it's been kind of a gamble with like letting cameras in and letting news media in. But if you look at the comments on the videos, it's majority people asking questions on how to join, you know, for as much as they tried to make you guys look bad.
Yeah, that's been a huge driver of growth. Again, I didn't like make the decision to publicize it. It's more that when we eventually started getting media requests, well, my rationale was we're going to be covered by the mainstream media eventually, and either we choose who does that first or it just happens. And it's interesting. Sky News, when they reached out, I looked at this journalist, Tom Cheshire, his previous work, and he seemed kind of fair in a lot of his reports and not like the most obvious hard left kind of person. So, so I invited him in specifically when he requested, just because I thought it would set the best tone. And at the end of the day, it's like their coverage was among the most explicitly hostile, but at the same time, like I think if it was CNN that did it first, if it was, I don't know, ABC or whoever that did it first, it probably would have set a different tone.
Okay, yeah.
So I think it was the right decision. And then deciding to talk to everyone else after, like they saw the reaction. They saw that people are not as openly hostile to this as, they would have expected would have been the case a few years ago. And, it's just really, really good timing where we're doing this. This is coming to light and public attention as the Republican Party and government officials are saying explicitly white identitarian things. I mean, the kind of stuff that Elon Musk is posting recently, millions and millions of people are seeing it. So it's playing really well. I think now is the time to push the public conversation. And as far as like progress throughout the year, I mean, it was slow and steady up to that point. I think we were around 200 members by August of this year.
Okay.
And then now we're like close to 1,000 just because of all the media attention. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, it's
so walk us through if any of the people watching would like to join. How does it work? Do you have like limited space? Are you building more buildings? I know there's like an application process. You have to do you take people who are single? Do they have to be couples? Like talk us through the kind of people that you're looking for and the application criteria and sort of what your maximum number of people is.
Sure. So it is an association for people who are interested in homesteading and intentional community, but it's also a lot more than that as well. So there are regional meetups and different interest groups and things like that, and like groups that are interested in business investment and business networking and things like that. So even if you're not in a position to actually move into a physical community, joining Return to the Land still might get you access to people that you could really benefit from, and also just that sense of community. And the fact that there are physical centers and it's not just a bunch of chat rooms makes it a little bit more real. It attracts a certain kind of person as well. Like I've been in these circles for a long time and I've known different groups, some of which organized, IRL, and there's a real like tangibly different culture and quality of person that are attracted to these different particular groups. Some of those cultures I like very much. I think they're upstanding people, like Patriot Front, everyone from them that I've met, huge fan of. I've met some other groups that I'm not as, drawn to and the kind of person that joins them. I mean, there are other good ones out there, but with Return to the Land, it tends to be very grounded people. And a lot of people actually do have families and do have resources because they're the kind of people, I believe, that are attracted to the idea of building parallel systems because they're good at building stuff. They're accomplished in their own right. They have that drive, that desire to build new things and new systems. Because they think they can do it, as opposed to if it's just a discussion group where they want to take political power. It's sort of parasitical by nature, right? It's like the government exists, all these resources exist as standing reserve, and we have to take that for ourselves. And I think the personality type that's attracted to that is not going to be as socially productive just by nature. So good people. And then as far as the actual intentional communities, we are national. There are multiple communities now in development besides this one here. Land has been purchased elsewhere. And there are a lot of people also with land in the broader network with opportunities outside of our particular type of intentional community. But the real like center of the whole association is this idea of homesteading communities that are share block companies because that allows people access to land ownership indirectly that probably wouldn't have it in many cases. Or like you wanted to homestead, but you don't know how to do it on your own. Well, there are opportunities to do that as a group where people around you, your neighbors, want to help you. They're ideologically aligned, and they want to help in things like childcare and homeschooling, and getting together for potluck dinners and things like that. So it's definitely not something that's widely available. There are other intentional communities, of course, but most of them, the vast majority, are very left wing. I lived in a housing co-op in Madison, Wisconsin for a year. That was very left wing. But even then, like, I enjoyed the community aspect. And we all had different chores, and there's a chore sign up sheet, and you had to put in a certain number of hours every month. And I just liked that sense of like, we're all mutually responsible for how this place looks and how it functions. So yeah, to actually move onto the land here, you wouldn't just have to join the association, return to the land. You would also have to come here in person and be approved to buy into the company. So there's sort of two levels of vetting. Joining the PMA, you go to the website, you take an interview, fill out a questionnaire, and then ultimately you'll be processed into our chats, where you can then organize a trip out here or to other communities or regional meetups. And then that in-person vetting starts to take place. And that's how you get to the next level of vetting, which is actually being approved to buy into one of these companies that own the land.
So outside of purchasing, if you're in the PMA, do you host 2 events per year where members can attend, like 3-day events or something like that?
Yeah, 2 big events, because a lot of people want to come down and visit, but they also want to meet a lot of other members. So having one time that's kind of agreed upon where everyone's invited tends to work out, and they've been really enjoyable events. So you are welcome to come down at other times of the year as well. And we've had minor meetups, like we did a July 4th meetup a couple of years ago. We'll probably do similar things. We also have 1 acre on the river. Some of the members here have 1 acre on the river. And so we'll probably do something in the summer, some kind of camp out there. But yeah, we have 2 big events, usually April and October. So this April, or possibly early May, we'll have our spring get together. And that'll be good. This last one in October was our biggest yet. So like I said, we're close to 1,000 members total. But just the event itself, there are more than 200 people actually here. And that's a pretty good turnout considering how limited the...
Was it a co-sponsored with a Patriot Front? And did Jared Taylor also show up as well for that gathering?
Yeah.
It's like 250 people.
Yeah. Yeah. So Patriot Front volunteered to help us with various tasks. So there are sort of 2 events in parallel. A very large work party where they put up fencing. They helped us reinforce some of our stream crossings that had been washed away previously, just by adding rock by hand. So it was stuff that if it had been up to us actually living here to do it, it would have taken a very long time, because it was that kind of task. You had to physically, manually put each rock in place. You couldn't do it with heavy machinery. So that was huge. That was very, very beneficial. And then in parallel, we had our kind of typical event where we had seminars, we had games, we had different craft things, and yeah, it was fun. And then ultimately we had kind of the big night, Saturday night, where we had our mainline speakers. So Jared Taylor gave a speech, which was very good, of course, and yeah, Thomas Rousseau of Patriot Front spoke, among others.
So if I can ask, how do you determine the ethnicity component? Do you like ask for a DNA test, or is it just sort of if you are accepted by the Grand Council as being white? Like, how does that work exactly?
I mean, it's mostly dependent on self-report. We do look at people's pictures. And so if we're not convinced just looking at a picture, we will ask for supplementary information. And, we tend to be relatively on the safe side in these admissions decisions. So if there's any ambiguity, we want to clear that up. There are the majority are totally unambiguous cases. You can just tell by looking at the person, and they self-report their ancestry. They say their family's been in the United States for generations, fought in the Revolutionary War, etc. Most of the time, that's sufficient. And, statistically, self-report coincides with DNA tested ethnicity, like the vast majority of the time. There will be people who try to infiltrate and try to get in on false pretenses like that. And you can't screen everyone up front. We have ways where we can process members out. That's at the PMA level. And we have kicked people out I don't know about for that particular reason, but for many other reasons. And then at the LLC level, the corporation, we do have ways where if we found out that, you lied about something like that, then we could potentially kick you out of the association and take away your residency rights. And then we would have a process where they would be fairly compensated for their share in anything they developed here. So we're not trying to take people's resources.
How much is a share? Like how much capital would someone have to have available to buy in?
Well, it depends on the seller. So all of the initial shares in the company were purchased a long time ago. So anything that's for sale and available now, that's up to the seller. But our shares are associated each with 3 acres on the land that we have the right to homestead. So I don't know, you could probably find one 10 to 12,000 right now, one of those shares. And there are a few available actually, because people come down, they think they want to develop, life gets in the way, they change their mind, whatever. So occasionally shares are available. And right now, somebody who owned 5 shares is deciding to sell, and he put some decent work into it, and doesn't look like he's asking too much.
So another thing I wanted to ask, we did a stream last night where we were workshopping with some of our members about things to ask you, and one of the things that came up is how do you deal with being connected to the banking system? Like, have you guys been debanked? Is there a threat of that? Do you have alternate systems, or do you think because you're in Arkansas, you're pretty safe from that, like you were saying before?
Yeah, we have multiple banks. Our main one is based in Arkansas, and I don't expect to be debanked, but we are building our own resilient systems and are affiliating with other networks out there. Like there's a credit union that will effectively be for people of European descent. It recently reached its capital requirements to start functioning. And so in the very near future, not only will we be able to deposit there, but also we will be able to use it as a lending institution. And lending is the big thing that's the limiting factor in our development, because very few people have the resources to build a homestead from scratch without financing. And you can't get a traditional construction loan because it's not fee simple deed ownership. So there's no good collateral for the bank. But B, you have the money and you want to homestead and want to build from scratch for yourself and want to live in rural Arkansas. So it's a fairly narrow intersection of the kind of people that want to do this, but many more people have the aspiration to do it, just not the financial resources. So when that credit union scales and we're integrated with it to a greater extent, I think that's going to really, really amp up development.
Right, and you guys are definitely looking to charge a very high interest rate, right? So you can make a lot of money on it.
Goes without saying. Yeah, 18, 20%, sure.
Well, yeah, because I was watching about the video on YouTube about building schools in the community update, and you were talking about rent to own and showing really small scale structures that were built from the ground up, but also modular and preparing to build them and expand over time as well. So I want people to understand how much you will work with people as much as humanly possible. It scales very low to very large in terms of who. It seems like if somebody has the desire to do it, you'll be able to give them as many resources as possible to join.
Yeah, that's the dream, is being able to accommodate every white person of good character if they want to live in one of these communities. The next developed community, technically people are sort of living there, but it's like in the very early stages of development.
Mhm.
That they've thought about financing a pretty intelligent, organized group actually had that going, that whole project before we met each other. So after we met them, we decided to kind of merge our structures. So that one in particular, I think will be a much more realistic option for people who don't have a lot of resources.
Mhm.
Ironically, like rural Arkansas, to join this community, you kind of have to already have some amount of capital to make it work well.
Mhm.
Whereas that one, it's near a larger city, predominantly white, one of the
Okay.
nicer cities with economic opportunity, and there will be financing options and modular development there as well. And the way they're developing, it's the way that Arania does it. So when and their ownership structure is slightly different, and I don't have to get into exactly what it is, but
Right.
anyway, when you join them, you'll basically have and they can do smaller lot sizes as well, because they're doing their septic system totally differently, and it's good. It's not exactly what our vision was for our more rural community. This is going to be more like a suburban development, half-acre lot, quarter-acre lot, and it's going to have water, sewer, and electric there in place, and then it's just up to you to build or to have something built. And they've worked with companies and have relationships with companies that will do financing on modular and things like that. So that one, I think there's a much, much larger segment of people who think our way that would actually be able to make that one work.
And so I know for PMAs, like essentially, if you want to go on the land, you would need to be a PMA, right?
Like if you want to visit,
Yeah.
well, I can have personal visitors. Other members can have personal visitors that aren't part of the association. But if you just wanted to show up as an individual with no particular like sponsor, then
Yeah.
yeah, you'd have to be in the association.
What if I saw that you guys needed a lot of help like building stuff and like labor and whatnot, and I was a PMA? Do people just come out to like for like it's I believe it's free to camp if they have their own tent and whatnot, and to be able to just participate in the community and build? Does that happen a lot?
Yes, we've had several, usually young guys. They show up, they camp. Sometimes, a member has a shed or something that's not being used, or a cabin that no one's staying in at the moment. And we find ways of accommodating those people. And also, very often, they find paid work too in the community. So if someone is developing their own lot, they'll be interested in hiring laborers. And typically, it's been pretty decent hourly wages, better than what you can find in the area. Now, it's not a guarantee, and that's not like our business. It's also not the PMA or the company that owns the land that are hiring these people. It's all between members. But that's the point of the association, is to help each other out. So, I mean, that's one of the big demographic groups that we do want to help: young men who are trying to get established. And I think every young man should have the skills to build a house, because ideally you own a house at some point and things are going to break down and you're going to have to do repairs. So if you know foundation to roof what goes into making a household operate, then I think you'll be just better set for life.
Yeah, because that was particularly interesting to me, because I'm a city boy that doesn't know anything about that. So it would be cool that if I fill out the PMA and things go through, and then I talk to the community, I'm just very interested in being able to come out, visit, and actually like help build. It's very appealing to me, just for the skill set and just for getting away from my goy slop life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And we've seen people really turn it around. Some people come out here and they just don't make it. Part of
Mhm.
that is the summer in Arkansas. It is very, very hot and people just aren't prepared for it. And sometimes they give up and leave. Sometimes other things happen and they realize that the problem wasn't what they thought it was in their life. Like they're running away from something. They come
Mhm.
out here and they realize those same demons, those same issues actually follow them, and they kind of get disillusioned. And so it doesn't work for everyone. It takes a certain kind of person to actually stick it out. But any PMA member is welcome to come down here. And if there is work going on, which there usually is, you're welcome to join in, hopefully paid if there are paid opportunities, or if you just want to volunteer, that's always available.
Yeah, I mean, if I went there and I could like stream in someone's shed, I'd really just like to participate and help. I was talking to my community about this last night. I just didn't know what the potential was or how it works, but it's very appealing to me because you don't have to rely on being like duplicitous. You know, a lot of people, I guess Nick Fuentes is like a very duplicitous person. But whenever I hear you speak, you don't have to really change your message. You're not really going back on what you said. Any question that someone has, you have a really in-depth answer for it. You know, as much as you are with philosophy, it's also equal parts actually physically building. So just the character of you and the people that I've seen there just really has sold me on it. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Yeah.
If I could ask, Eric,
important to me, and I think it's actually good that before I was doing all this, I was running effectively a philosophy channel, because a lot of the very earliest people to get linked up, they knew me from my YouTube channel back when it had 12,000 subscribers.
Yeah.
And I talked about Plato, I talked about this sort of thing. So I think that selected for a certain type from the get-go.
Well, also, didn't a professor from a college ask you to potentially teach Neoplatonism, a class?
Yeah, John Vervaeke out of the University of Toronto. So he's relatively well known online. He's a PhD in philosophy and cognitive science, and he had his own kind of online school. We had several conversations on Platonism, Neoplatonism, and so he was going to invite me to basically teach his Plato course, which is he considers himself a Platonist. That was kind of his main deal with anyway. And then ultimately they kind of found out what I was doing here.
Yeah.
I got uninvited from that, but yeah.
All right, Fist, I'm done being a fangirl for a moment. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask if you have a church at all down at Return to the Land. Do you have any views on religion being there, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so there isn't really one plurality denomination that most of our members subscribe to. We have Lutherans, Orthodox, non-denominational Catholics, and basically we go to church at our respective denominations nearby. So some kind of church building ultimately would be awesome. We're just not there yet in terms of development. It's been 2 years, and just roads and basic infrastructure. And like for our community center, we don't even have a proper building yet. It's just a pavilion, so it's open walls. And all this stuff is very expensive, and it's only a handful of people here doing all the work. And the budget is what we ourselves come up with. We don't have like outside financing. I'm just saying, like, people have expectations sometimes that I want to.
I wasn't sure.
Set the expectations more realistically.
I wasn't sure actually how far away from civilization. I use that term like loosely, but how far away are you from like the nearest town, or so particularly for the city fags who come there? It's just like how far away from you are you from sort of the nearest like town or city?
Well, the nearest like mid-sized city, I guess, would be Jonesboro, which has a population around 70 something thousand. The metro area, if you can call it that, has like 100,000, and that's about an hour away. Closer than that, there are towns that have 7 to 10,000, and it's convenient enough for shopping, for finding a church, for most of the essentials, for finding really good, high-paid employment. It's not great. It's an economically depressed area. There are good jobs out of Jonesboro, but again, it's an hour away. So the first community is really for a particular type of person. And a lot of the young guys who come here without either remote work available or existing independent financing, they end up doing work here for various members. So like, for instance, I'm actually building my proper house here currently, and I've hired various young guys to help out, and that helps to sustain them. But there are other opportunities. Like there's one line of work that a lot of younger folks in this area go for, which is working on the barges on the Mississippi. And they make pretty good money, but they're away for a month at a time. So even if, the work here dried up somehow and, there weren't good opportunities in a nearby town, we'll help you find opportunities, and there are economic opportunities for those who are willing to work.
Right. I mean, if you're only like an hour away from a mid-sized town, that's not. I guess in my mind, I sort of imagined that you were like 2 or 3 hours away. Like
It's called the Ozarks, right? It sounds like
down in the the middle of the Ozarks. Like that sounds.
We're
That
right in
sounds
the
obviously
foothills.
you. Obviously,
We're really
you
not
have
in the
internet.
middle of the Ozarks. We're like barely into the Ozarks. So
Right.
okay.
Obviously, you have internet and other infrastructure because you're talking to us now. You take members from anywhere basically, right? Like they don't they have to be like heritage Americans, or do you would you take like Anglos from other countries and stuff as well?
yeah, we would. We're not a white American association. We are an association for people of European heritage. So, I mean, I personally care about my own ancestry coming from America. Like white Americans, I think, should be recognized as an ethnic type. We should have some kind of recognition where the survival of our particular people does matter. Like replacing us with a bunch of Swedes wouldn't be just as good in my eyes. Like there's something distinct and unique about being an American, like a heritage white American. But that's not the goal of the association. The association is for people of European heritage, and technically it's international. We do have members in Europe. We have members in Canada. I think we have a couple in Australia. So if you have European ancestry, wherever you live, also, we are trying to help build these networks. Now, some of them, it's very unlikely that a full-fledged community is going to spring up anytime soon. Like personally, I'm a little bit pessimistic about Canada. I tend to recommend that if Canadians can come to the US, they should. But in other places, you wouldn't expect, like some countries in, say, Eastern Europe or like the Balkans, there are really promising prospects. And the most interesting thing is like finding such a truly diverse group of people, with some of whom really have resources and vision and want to see something big happen, especially in Europe. So yeah, there's definitely a role wherever you are, and particularly if you're in the UK, I tend to recommend look into the Woodlander Initiative. Simon, who runs that, it's basically structured the way we're structured, but it's tailored to the British context, which is legally a lot more difficult. And they've made a lot of ground. Like they've purchased a lot of ground, and they have events. So there's stuff happening all over, really.
Yeah, man, that sounds amazing. I'm really impressed how much thought, like actual proper thought, and not just complaining on the internet, has gone into this. I'm really impressed. Like, given, like as you were pointing out before, given the sort of current moment of just being incendiary on Twitter and sort of thinking that makes a difference, you guys seem to have really like planned properly. That's very, very impressive. You got any more questions, Artie?
Well, it's so we've seen so much on the left with like left-wing community organizing, and I feel like this is like the first instance of like right-wing community organizing. Like, do you consider yourself a community organizer?
I guess so. I mean, technically, by the literal definition, I am. I wouldn't say I'm the first. I mean, there are long-lasting white communities, explicitly white communities in the US that I visited. There's the Christian Identity Church in Missouri. I posted about that on X, and everyone reacted really violently at it. Ultimately, they requested it was taken down, probably because they saw the reactions and they weren't expecting that. Because I'm all for it. I don't believe that we are descended from the lost tribes of Israel, but whatever. I mean, if that helps them build an actual white community, and there are hundreds of people there, all sorts of young, like healthy looking, normal acting white people, whatever their beliefs are, it's like that's a positive thing. So they've existed for a long time. Other Christian identity groups have existed. There's one in Harrison, Arkansas. They have a community center. They have all sorts of stuff. Of course, there's been groups in the Pacific Northwest, especially Idaho, for a very long time. Some of that, infamously, but there are still groups up there, and still like community networks up there. In Texas, there's the network in the Dallas area, and they don't have a traditional intentional community, but they're definitely organized as a community. They have homeschooling groups. There's actually a big network people wouldn't expect in, I'll just say, the Northeast. They're very, very low key in one of the states you would least expect.
I'm in the Northeast.
Yeah, I mean, they're hard to get in touch with because it's all, someone in person, they're a good person, competent, and also like gradually they test to see if they can sort of let them into the network. So yeah, unfortunately I can't like hook you up with those people directly.
Oh, dude, I'm a piece of shit. All right. No, I'm a good character. You didn't tell me that in the beginning.
Well,
I'm just kidding. So, so also what's on the horizon with what we're seeing with the kosher centrists, so to speak, is they're warning of a rise of paganism. Okay. So I'm assuming that they're going to call you a pagan. Since I was saying I was going to be speaking with you, of course, a pagan leaped out of nowhere and started talking to me. And so, are there any limitations on a religious, like what someone believes in, that you would be like, that doesn't really vibe with what we're doing?
So we have that community I was telling you about. That one is Christian only. Our first community, we don't have any religious limitation other than it's a traditional European religion. So if someone can't come here and practice Islam or Judaism or Buddhism, like those are not European faiths, but European paganism or Christianity, those things are accepted. Now, we think it's better to be a bigger tent organization. And that way, if we can help pagans find community, great. If we can help Christians find community, great. And then myself, coming from a Platonic background, it's like I'm reading pagan Neoplatonists all the time. And I think their metaphysics was correct. So it's like at one level, I sort of like, I'm not a pagan in that I am a Christian and I believe in the teachings of Jesus and himself as a divine incarnation. However, I do think that most of Orthodox Christian theology and the early unorthodox branches of it kind of came from that milieu and was heavily influenced by it. And so I sort of consider myself in both camps to some extent. I kind of reconcile the pagan element, the Christian element, and there's even intellectual precedent for that. Prior to the time of, actually shortly after the time of Justinian, Olympiodorus, teaching in Alexandria, was a pagan professor and yet explained to his Christian students how, it seems that Plato is a polytheist, but actually this is an esoteric monotheism where the different aspects of this one first God, you can call it, the one, the good, the first God, or God simply. Proclus even says that you can call the one God simply. So Olympiodorus explains that to his students, and it seems like there's these big tensions. Before I was even into Platonism, I was kind of a perennialist in that I saw there was some kind of commonality in these traditions around the world. And why wouldn't there be? Because we all have the same access to the nature of reality, being that we're part of reality. We can kind of reflect on those, whether they're archetypes of the collective subconscious or however you want to phrase it or think of it. We tend to kind of land on these same elementary ideas around the world. And I think especially between pagan Neoplatonism and Christian Neoplatonism, and then like Orthodox Christianity following it, that holds very well in my mind. And I think God, in his wisdom and providence, has allowed for all peoples to have all the tools they need to grow closer to him. And this, may be considered a heretical view, but I do think that pagan worship for many people is a way and has been a way for them to draw closer to God. I don't think it's all the way. I think if that's the stage of development that you're at, fine. I do think the teachings of Jesus are necessary for ultimate salvation. However, I don't get the argument that like God would have allowed all these people around the world, basically everyone who wasn't Jewish at a certain point in time, everyone to universally worship demons and be ultimately spiritually misled. I do think he providentially attended the philosophy of Plato and Pythagoras before him, and the institutions surrounding the old gods. I think those were providentially attended as well, because providence attends all things, and God turns all things to good, even if it wasn't, 100% spot on how it should have been from the get-go.
Right. And so it seems like a conversation has to happen on the right wing right now, right? We have our, more moderate ones, and then ones that are kind of having this sense of race. How do you rectify the universalism of Christianity with a person advocating for their own race? Because a lot of Christians are going to push back and say, well, you're focusing on a race when there's this universal aspect of being Christian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like just a reading comprehension issue, because God creates the nations. He tells Jesus tells his disciples to go make disciples of the nations. Like, they go and convert nations. And the history of Christianity has been mostly like whole nations converting, especially in Northern Europe, often because the monarch converts, and then like this is now the religion of the land. And then in the book of Revelation, like it says pretty explicitly that the nations will still exist. So the nation is an organic type developed by God, and God didn't make a mistake in creating the nations. He made male and female, and when we die, we're still male or female. That's just part of our nature, and the nation that we belong to is part of our nature. Now, we shouldn't reject the nature that God gave us. There are verses, this is Paul to is it Galatians, the infamous verse about there's neither Jew nor Gentile.
Oh, yeah. Been hearing that one a lot lately.
Yeah. Well, like, obviously, he says in the same passage, there's neither male nor female. But elsewhere, Paul goes on at length about the different responsibilities and expectations for men and women. So what is he saying there? He's saying at a metaphysical level, men and women have the same access to salvation. Plato says something similar if you know how to read him. In the Republic, it said that men and women share the same virtues. But he's talking specifically about the guardians. And the guardians are supposed to be, in the ideal society, the ones who rise to the very top, the true aristocratic philosophical type. These are like the consummated individuals who are getting closest to the archetypal virtues of humanity generally. Mm-hmm. So what he's saying there is that we converge at the very top on the same ultimate virtues. But then at a lower order, of course, like a carpenter doesn't have precisely the same virtues in his craft as a shoemaker, and there's going to be differentiation and specialization, and everyone isn't exactly the same. And so it's like, again, black and white thinking. People think it has to be universalism or it has to be particularism. But in Platonism and Christianity, there is that universal human nature that we have to respect because God divinizes it. Or in Platonism, it's divine from the start. And there's also the order of particulars, the world of generation. And there are laws structuring the world of generation that aren't identical to the principles of metaphysics. So you kind of have to absorb the law at every level where it's appropriate. And it depends on what your purpose is. So in worship of the divine, yeah, it's not necessary to constantly bear in mind the fact of your biological sex or your biological nation. You should be able to transcend those particular world of generation kind of qualities. However, in the secular order, there are these different types, and those are all because of God's nature, not in spite of God's nature.
Okay. When would you when did you become a Platonist first or a Christian first?
Well, I had read Plato, and I sort of was. Well, let me back up. So,
Sure.
I mean, I was raised sort of Christian. My mom was raised Catholic. My dad was basically a lifelong agnostic. And when I was very young, we didn't go to church at all. And then ultimately, like, I started thinking about religious questions. I asked my mom to take me to church. So we went to the Catholic church for a little while. I asked the priest, like, I want to know more about God. Can you explain the nature of God? And I got this really discouraging answer from the priest, which was, you can't know God, basically. Just read the Bible and
Right.
shut up, essentially. So, so that didn't last. And then I was an atheist for a while, and then a Catholic again.
I'm still a dog shit atheist right now.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I have a religious audience though.
Okay.
I'm very close to going in a direction.
Gotcha. Well, keep pursuing the truth, right? A little bit of philosophy leads you away from God. A lot leads you back. Francis Bacon actually said that. So yeah, so after going back to Catholicism right before college, I dropped away again, became an atheist, and then got into perennialism and Eastern philosophy and quasi new age beliefs.
Yeah.
And then it was through that ultimately I kind of understood what Christianity was saying. I read Alan Watts' book on Christianity, which is actually really, really good. His lectures are, impressive, but many people would criticize that as like kind of vacuous new age talk, because that's the kind of people who play him in the background in their store selling hemp products or whatever.
Right.
But actually he was a scholar, and he has a bunch of well-sourced books on various religious topics, including Christianity, in this case specifically the Catholic Church, and how it essentially represents these same eternal principles that you would recognize if you were just a Platonist or a metaphysical perennialist or any of that. And just like many people find a vehicle for their reason in Eastern philosophy when they couldn't find it in Western philosophy, which really was my story. Well, there is a place for that application of reason and mapping those basic archetypes that are just unavoidable onto a religious practice. It's just that in the West, that was the esoteric element of it. In the East, somehow everything was exoteric. Everything, like the philosophy, was just the religion. And that's with some exceptions, because there are plenty of people in India who are totally deluded about what their religion even is. They are just worshiping idols. They have no idea what the Upanishads are about, which are written in dialogue form. I believe Plato was absolutely influenced by them, as well as many of the axial age thinkers. So yeah, I started thinking about Christianity again from a perennialist perspective, having read a bit of Plato at that point. And then actually, it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I really dove deeper and deeper and deeper and read the Neoplatonic sources. I had read like a little bit of Plotinus, like most people do, who are intellectually curious. And I didn't even know what to make of it at the time.
Right.
It wasn't until I started reading Proclus that it all
that was the catalyst for you.
Yeah, specifically his Elements of Theology. That was I read a lot of philosophy, and I respected the philosophers that I'd read. Schopenhauer, I was a big fan of Schopenhauer. But it wasn't until I read Elements of Theology I'd read like modern philosophy at that point. Everything else in the history of philosophy made sense to me. And I felt like, okay, I could have come up with this. I get where this is coming from. And it was just like leading my own reason a little bit further. Whereas with the Elements of Theology, it was like I was just puzzled by these statements, which it's 211 propositions numbered, where it gives the thesis and then a justification. And he builds, it's structured like the elements of geometry of Euclid.
Yeah.
So basic propositions, then he builds on it. And a lot of the basic propositions don't exactly make sense at first, and yet at another level they're very intuitive and obvious. So it, and then he like draws conclusions that I know that I would not have drawn in the course of my own lifetime, even with applied study. And really, he's the only philosopher I felt that way about. And I had read like Leibniz and stuff. So he was, that was a game changer. And then I started going deeper into all the various Neoplatonic commentaries and sources. And that's what I spend my time doing. Like, I find that far more philosophically rewarding, not just for historical purposes, but like more philosophically engaging than any recent author, including people that I like reading a lot. Like, I enjoyed Chris Langan. You know, I appreciate the CTMU and everything that he does there. But yeah, I think Neoplatonism is a very overlooked area. I veered off your question though, so I was sort of
not a problem. I just like hearing you go sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, I also so you were, I think sometime last year, working on building a school, like for children on the property.
Well, I mean, we have a homeschool co-op that
Yep.
either meets or doesn't meet, depending on how everyone's feeling.
Yeah.
Even that like level of organization is a bit tricky, because how do you go about doing that? Do you have one mom have all the kids together at the same time? That's kind of overwhelming for that mom.
Yep.
So we've experimented with it. We've not found and we don't have a lot of physical spaces.
Right.
So when we were running it for a while, before getting a call, So yeah, when we were running it before, we had very little space. It was actually in this building here, which like you can see where the wall is. It's not a huge building here.
Right.
So anyway, we would like to have a more permanent space and, you know, desks and everything
what's
like that.
What's the curriculum like for like homeschooling?
Well, in Arkansas, there's a lot of latitude, so it depends on what you want to teach as a parent. Of course, I try to have my kids educated in, you know, up to the standards that the state would set in public school. So they're at level in terms of their math, their reading, etc. And my oldest is 9 now, recently turned 9. So it's really, you know, we haven't even gotten into the subtle, complex areas of history. Most of that I really teach conversationally when my kids have questions about the world, or, you know, what is America and where do we come from, etc. So a lot of homeschoolers like just spending the time with your kid, and because you're the parent and they're the child, they absorb a lot better than if they're just in a room of children and then one stranger teaching you. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of a flexible curriculum. Moving forward, like I really appreciate School of the West, the resources they've drawn together, and they have workbooks now that are for sale. So if you are a homeschooling white identitarian parent, then that's available. They're based out of Missouri, actually. And yeah, I totally endorse I wouldn't call it quite a curriculum yet, but they're building towards that. Doug Wilson has a school in Idaho. He's like, what is his denomination? He's some kind of like relatively basic Protestant, but he has some like interesting theological and soteriological positions that I wouldn't expect from a Protestant. Like he's a post-millennial, which, do you know what that is?
What's a post-millennial?
So many people have heard of like pre-tribbers versus post-tribbers.
Okay.
So those are the pre-tribbers are those who believe that the rapture happens when, or rather before, the events in the book of Revelation, before the tribulation. So all of the true believers are kind of lifted out of the world. And that's a lot of what is this book series called? It was very popular. Kirk Cameron starred in a film
Left Behind.
Left Behind. Series? Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So, I mean, I read those books. I kind of enjoyed them, but I don't think it's the way that you should interpret book of Revelation. Anyway, and then post-tribbers are, you know, the Christians remain, and then the rapture is something that kind of happens after, in coincidence with receiving your glorified body or something like that. But people generally don't know about pre-millennial and post-millennial. Most people are pre-millennial by default, the millennium is this 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. And people assume that when Christ comes with his second coming, that then brings on this millennium, which for some reason, after 1,000 years, he has to like finally seal Satan.
It's a nice round, even number. Okay.
Yeah, right. Now, the post-millennials say that Christ's reign happens after the millennium. The millennium, instead, is something that we have to bring about through our own effort. And so I think Doug Wilson believes the millennium hasn't happened or is agnostic about it. But I actually think there's a case to be made that the millennium did already happen, and it started with the Middle Ages. And now, as Christian civilization has declined, like we're reaching the end of the millennium. This was the best that a human-run order was going to get, and now we're running out the clock on that, and actually will face the revelation time kind of stuff. I have an article actually on Arctos for those interested in like end times stuff, where I talk about AI in the Book of Revelation and how it really surprisingly lines up, and also how it lines up with Platonic philosophy. So anyway, yeah, Wilson, incidentally, totally aside the point, but he has a school where he uses a classics kind of curriculum, so trivium, and then he uses a lot of classical sources. I'm also in favor of that, but like my kids aren't exactly of an age to be able to read Virgil yet. So
yeah,
so it tends to just be like reading and writing, and we get worksheets off various websites.
I feel like people are just in general, when they hear homeschooling, it doesn't necessarily put an image in their mind of like what that looks like. So that's why I just kind of wanted to ask a clarifying question of what that might look like.
Sure.
Fist, you got anything?
Should we? We've got some super chats.
Yeah.
Since we're winding up.
Let's just do ones that are relevant.
Yeah. So Deadpool Kid says, glad to see Eric Aarvoll here. I was one day hoping to ask him about what his approach was to those who say Christianity is a psyop by the juice. I have a hard time believing everything is a psyop. Do you want to have a crack at that, Eric, or is that a very complicated
question?
question?
I think it's unlikely that a psyop would have tremendously benefited Europe and Western civilization, which I think objectively it did. You could arguably say that Christianity led to the decline of high Roman culture, art, philosophy. Like they defaced statues, they did censor academic works, and in some cases execute, like Hypatia, the Neoplatonic philosopher, was killed in Alexandria by a mob of Christians. And Justinian, he took over the Neoplatonic schools, force converted the professors. So it's not like it was wholly a benign and innocuous thing. But going forward, though, having that ethos really instilled, especially in Northern Europe, of reciprocal forgiveness, like of prioritizing logos as this eminent, like leading principle in the world. I do think that led to the culture of the Middle Ages, where really our civilization as we know it was born. And that wouldn't have happened without Christianity. I mean, pagan Northern Europe wasn't, I think, as philosophically developed as the more Platonic Mediterranean sphere. And maybe they would have reached it anyway. But when you look at like the introduction of Christianity into Ireland, prior to Christianization, there were a bunch of clans at war with each other perpetually, like blood feuds, like Hatfields and McCoys, right? Who are the Scots-Irish here, just a little bit of Irish admixture realistically, but still, like that's the way these societies were. And then when Christianity came to them, they stopped that behavior and started developing economically when they really hadn't for hundreds of years. It's not like Northern Europe has always been backwards. I mean, arguably, and we don't have written sources from these times, so it's hard to infer everything. But during the time of the Nordic Bronze Age, that was a time when they were on a par in terms of material culture with Mycenaean Greece, for example. Or like even further back than then, some of the more advanced stuff, in the early Bronze Age was actually in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and not in the Mediterranean zone. Anyway, just to say, it's not like Northern Europeans or barbarians and the Meds civilized them. I think it's a much more complex story, but Christianity did seem to civilize them. So that's one thing. If it was just a psyop, why did it work to help us? And why does it still work to turn people's lives around and actually like make them give up their vices and get on the straight and narrow and just sort themselves out? Why is it so effective? I've seen people, their lives are actually transformed, and that's not always the case. And I have known a lot of pagans as well. So far, I have not seen, aside from, I guess, Hinduism, which is an ongoing tradition, that also has a lot of similarities with Christianity. Like they believe in the divine incarnation. That's, again, one of the reasons I got into Christianity at all, because I thought of the concept of the avatar as something that's logical. If God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, then he'll make himself appear for all creatures. Why wouldn't he? And so he would incarnate from time to time as the most direct and personal way of manifesting himself. Anyway, so I've seen that like turn around in some people in other religious traditions, specifically Hinduism. Again, not typical Indian Hinduism, but kind of the high philosophy of it. And then I've seen that in Christians. I've not really seen it in pagans. But I think what happened was Jews, it was a legalistic tradition that was not particularly exceptional before you started having some people who were reading Plato in the Jewish community rewrite the religion. And so I'm sort of like a semi-Marcionite in a way, in that I think the oldest layer of Yahweh, the Yahwist tradition, and I subscribe mostly to the critical theory kind of stuff, critical reading of the Bible, the layered document kind of hypothesis, Tübingen school. Not that I consider myself an expert in it. It's just when I look at the data, it seems like that's correct. And even Catholic scholars often take that for granted. So it's not necessarily unorthodox, lowercase o. But anyway, I think that oldest layer was probably not even monotheistic. I think it was a henotheistic tradition where they made a pact with a particular deity, but I think that deity was more likely a malevolent spirit than a positive one. Evidently, Porphyry, the Neoplatonist, thought that Yahweh was the demiurge of the earth as opposed to the universal demiurge. So I think something like that was more or less true at a particular time. Like Judaism, maybe they weren't explicitly worshiping the devil, but it wasn't entirely wholesome. It wasn't like the one true path. But Judaism in the 2 centuries before Christ became increasingly Platonic. And there's work from Russell Gmerkin on this, from the texts of the Old Testament themselves. And he draws all these parallels between Greek historical traditions, etc. And you would expect that to be the case when the Septuagint was translated. Many people think that's when the Old Testament was largely written. There aren't written sources prior to the Septuagint. There are fragments, but those fragments are usually like parts of prayers, which of course they would use the same like incantations and prayers that they had been using for generations. They would just set it in this kind of Platonic rewriting of their tradition in a more intentional way. They would set it with all of these Hellenistic influences. The Septuagint is in Greek. These were Greek-speaking, literate scholars in Alexandria that came up with the translation. And then the Hasmonean dynasty. These were Hellenistic Jews who became hardline in Jewish legalism only around that time, and all the archaeological evidence points to this. Prior to that, going back to the 5th, 6th century, the Jewish communities that we have, there's no evidence of strict adherence to dietary laws or anything resembling practicing Judaism. So they went hard line with it, probably under the influence of Plato's political theory. That's my view. Anyway, so this, and then by the 1st century CE or AD, you have Philo, of course, the explicitly Jewish and Platonic philosopher and exegete. And that's the milieu that Jesus is raised in. And he sees this. He recognizes this, having right reason, because he is, an avatar in my view. which you would predict also from a Neoplatonic perspective, where every series of beings converges on a monad that's the superior and archetypal member of the series. So like of horses, there's archetypal horse. Of men, there's archetypal man. And there's a soul that corresponds to that. And so that's what I believe Jesus is. That's my Christology. It's Neoplatonic, not conventional. Anyway, you're asking my views, and it's like a fringe historical reading, but I think actually the evidence is on my side, and I would very gladly debate it at length. It's just you have to draw on a lot of different sources: textual, archaeological, comparative religion, and then just like a rational narrative to make sense of it. So I think what Jesus was kind of a Platonic inclined, perennialist inclined, taking in Hindu axial age wisdom as well, and synthesizing it and seeing that like the truth underlying my religious tradition is this much larger thing. And my connection with divinity is not the way this legalistic, exoteric Judaism is teaching it. So I think he was an esoteric monist, like all the axial age faiths. And I think, well, he was also the avatar again, but just how did his life proceed and what was he doing in that context? I think he was, like Marcion and others thought, rejecting a certain layer of the Old Testament God. Not that the entire Old Testament was only influenced by the devil or something like that, but I think Jesus clarifies, he doesn't come to abrogate the law, but to perfect it. And I think that's basically a double entendre on Torah, which the Hebrew Torah meant both the written documents, the law, but also, the laws of nature. They would call the Torah like the same as the Hindus would call the Arta, or the Egyptians would call the Meh, or the Greeks would call universal Logos. So he was saying he came to perfect that by drawing the Jewish tradition more in line with this philosophical, logocentric. I'm not using that in the Derridian sense there, just centered on logos, centered on philosophy, way of thinking. And so I think he liberated the flaws of Judaism, and many Jews converted because it was compelling. And then I think very quickly what actually had happened was kind of papered over. That's my opinion. And I draw that from some of the very earliest documents. And there aren't a lot to go on. And, if you believe in any conspiracy theories in the modern day, things get, covered up within months, within years. We have this narrative of the mid 20th century, for example, that's widely believed in an age of mass information. And yet we know when you study it more closely, a lot of things don't add up. And so I think that's kind of what happened is the Jewish community, like you read about the Judaizers, if you read the early church fathers. And I think that's the more hardline and less sophisticated kind of Jewish subversion of the early Christian movement. I think the more subtle Judaizers were what, no offense, News Fist, were what became like the Orthodox Church. Not that they are still just like crypto Jews today, but I think it was part of the way that Orthodoxy developed, and especially the way they looked at the Old Testament was influenced by the Jewish community, and it was kind of a psyop. So that's my view, is that mainstream Christianity as it developed became kind of a Jewish psyop, but Jesus himself was trying to correct the parochial thinking of the Jews, who were highly tribalistic to a fault, to become more universalistic and Platonic and perennialist and like properly axial age in their orientation and disposition. And I think God, it's like in Catholic legend surrounding the Good Friday to Easter time frame, they say that Jesus went down into the very bottom of hell and offered salvation to even the lowest descended souls. And that way his salvation could be truly universal. So by the same logic, then, where would God go as an incarnation? he would go to the very lowest, morally speaking, group and rectify them. And that way you can rectify all of mankind. So this is like the inversion. Instead of the Jews are God's special chosen people who deserve to teach everyone because they're just the heroes of history. Instead, it is that this group of people was Machiavellian and deceptive and manipulative and demonically inspired. And Jesus came to them specifically to rectify them, to prove that God does turn all things to good. So that's my interpretation.
Good answer, man.
And Eric, do you happen to have any courses on what you're discussing? If anybody would like to follow up on any of this knowledge.
Well, the Christianity stuff, no, because I don't consider myself an expert. I just say what I personally believe, and I'm open to being corrected or criticized or anything like that. I do teach courses on Plato and Aristotle and the Neoplatonists on Thinkific. So it's aarvoll.thinkific.com. And there's one course on Pythagoras. Right now we're doing the first Alcibiades. We use the Iamblichian curriculum. So this Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus came up with a kind of canonized set of dialogues, which seem to have already been in use, at least partially, for the Middle Platonists, because there are these like stock dialogues that get quoted. But because Iamblichus kind of canonizes this particular set of 12 dialogues, first Alcibiades, Gorgias, Phaedo, Cratylus, Theaetetus, Office Statesman, Philebus, Timaeus, and Parmenides.
People that we're all clearly familiar with, you know.
These are dialogues. These are Platonic dialogues. Yeah. So anyway, this is like the canonized set of dialogue. What happened though after that is that all of these Neoplatonic authors wrote commentaries on specifically this set of dialogues. So the vast majority of commentaries we have is actually, like, I'm sure most people have heard of commentaries on Plato.
Yeah.
And it's taught in the context of, oh yeah, for this period of antiquity, they didn't make progress because everyone was obsessed with simply commenting on Plato. And that's not the case. They made actually a considerable amount of mathematical and philosophical progress. In many ways, I think like the early Dark Ages was the height of philosophical accomplishment, the early 7th century. Figures like Simplicius, who no one reads today. But anyway, so that means essentially that the core teaching curriculum of the last centuries of antiquity, we have that set of dialogues. We have all of the a lot of the commentaries that went with it, and we know like how they thought of their teaching methods. So sort of it's like a anthropological experiment and also a pedagogy and just a good way to learn ancient thought. And many people don't realize also that Neoplatonism really put together all of the philosophical schools. Like Aristotelianism ceased to operate as an independent school around the 4th century, right? There were kind of oppositional peripatetics and Platonists before that, but then towards the end of antiquity, everything merged. There was an independent Stoic school and institution, and then by the 4th, 5th century AD, everything blended. And so they kind of standardized the teaching of ancient philosophy, and we have that curriculum specifically. So I'm a big proponent of it. Also, the Aristotle side of the curriculum is still relevant, and there's really awesome commentaries. Some of the Aristotelian commentaries even more interesting than the Platonic commentary, because towards the end of antiquity, when the teaching of Platonism was effectively outlawed, they kept teaching Aristotle because Aristotle isn't explicitly and obviously a pagan, like he was, but Plato talks about Zeus and Hermes and all these characters. Aristotle doesn't. And
okay, wait. I think we're gonna have to wrap it up. Artie has to take a bio break. That is very fascinating stuff. I might take a look at your course. So I'm definitely gonna check out the 211.
Well, it's funny because this is how I passively have listened to him, where I'll just like put on like a whatever 20-minute video as I'm like driving. I'm just like passively listening to him. Like, I'd like to talk to him, but then I just end up passively listening to what he's saying when he's talking in person. So we were, as hosts, we weren't exactly jumping in, so don't feel too bad.
Oh, well, I mean, it's not, a lot of it is not my area of expertise, man. I'm not kind of like, I have nothing to say on it. But thank you so much for coming, Eric. I really appreciate you taking the time. Do you have like a website or something? I posted your like course link in the chat. Where do we find Return to the Land? If you wish to return to the land, how does one? What's your website link?
Yeah, it's ironic. To return to the land, first go to this website. It's returntotheland.org.
Okay.
And you can find information there. We have a Substack, a frequently asked questions and all of that. And yeah, besides that, I'm on X at Aarvoll_, and then YouTube at Eric Aarvoll. So, by the way, the Aarvoll, that's the spelling of my surname when it was in Norway. And then my actual last name is Aarvoll, Orwoll. When the pronunciation Aarvoll is really how like my screen name should be pronounced if we were all Norwegian. So it's just sort of this kludge of a name that came together. But anyway, it stuck. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well let's wrap it up. I wish you all the success, and I hope to come and like check this out. Maybe next time in the States. Again, thank you for taking the time. Any last words, Adi?
I'm glad that at the beginning of this, before we went live, he was like, "Oh, you got a lot of videos of Fuentes." I'm glad you fought through that. I'm glad you trusted me. Might have looked a little weird at first, but I'm glad you fought through it and had this conversation with us because I was really excited to talk to you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the invite.
Awesome.
All right. Good night. See you later, guys.
Later, fellas.